If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Rangers, forest people, what strange or unexplained things have you seen in the woods? I just work for a county park, but I get there before the sunrise, and I've definitely been weirded out once or twice. First off, possums, raccoons, foxes, and coyotes all make a variety of peculiar noises, many of which I was not previously familiar with. Some sound like demons, some sound like crying children, and some are just kind of their own thing and defy immediate description. The only creepy thing I've ever seen were lights in the woods. It's hard to tell how far away they are, I would guess 300 to 400 meters, but it's dark. They're a yellowish sort of white and appear to quickly and smoothly fade on and off in the span of about a second. I've only ever seen one light at a time, and after it happens once, there are no repeats. It's too bright to be a firefly, not bright enough to be a distant car, and too smooth and random to be someone with a flashlight. My imagination has drifted to stories of will-o-wisps, but I think it's probably just some kind of bioluminescence or else an optical illusion brought about by squinting to see through a darkened forest. One of our properties has an abandoned hunting shack on it. My coworker and I decided to check it out to see if it was creepy, and it wasn't. No vandalism, due to being on private property deep in the woods, just some hangers and boxes labeled files. We left and made sure to shut the door tight so animals or bugs wouldn't get in. We passed the shack the next day in our buggy, and the door was wide open, but the screen door was shut. No one goes on this property, and hunting has ceased there. My thoughts were towards OSHT, someone's making a meth lab here. I closed the door using my machete while calling out, if anyone's in there, it's none of my business. I did some volunteer work helping clear brush in Texas state parks a couple times a year, and we came across a trail of 6 dead animals that looked like they were torn to shreds. Pretty common, as Texas has mountain cats and coyotes. This was different, though. They led off the trail and into this dried up ravine where 2 armadillo bodies were lying spread open on a rock with blood and entrails everywhere. We ended up calling the ranger to come down and inspect it. It turns out he experienced that kind of thing occasionally, but never more than 1 or 2 bodies. The animals weren't hunted, they were sacrificed by kids who used to sneak into the park at night and do rituals. After searching the area with him, guess what we found? Some animal entrails were nailed to a tree. Below the tree, the grass was cleared, and a little rock formation was made at its base. I didn't think people actually did that crap. Not my story, but my friend's. He took his 7 to 8-year-old son fishing with him up in the mountains. They first try a couple regular spots by the stream. After a few hours with no bites, they go deeper, following the stream. It's at this point that his son starts saying, "Dad, look, there's another guy here too." Obviously, my friend sees nobody, says it's nothing, and they keep fishing. After settling on a new spot, he notices his son acting really strange. Kind of nervous, scared, and almost hiding a bit. He asks his son again what's wrong, to which the response is, "The man is hanging over there by that tree." There's nothing there, but of course, after hearing that, they both jetted off. He hasn't gone back to that area since. When I was pretty new to hunting, my brother and I were up in this sort of open-ended, horseshoe-shaped canyon up in the mountains, hunting elk, with bows. We both had radios, so we could talk to each other. Right around the bottom of the horseshoe, the foliage opened up, and I could see my brother right down below me, about 100 yards down the canyon. I kept an eye on him so I could match his pace and kept walking forward when I saw something exiting the foliage that he just exited. I didn't have binoculars, but I did have my rangefinder, which has a small zooming ability. I take it out and look at the thing. It's a cougar, down in a stalking stance, following my brother. I get on the radio and tell him not to move, there's a cougar behind him, and it knows he's there. So he just stops dead in his tracks and doesn't even use the radio. It felt like I was watching that thing for forever before it turned around and left. It's ducking terrifying that those things are so silent. It was so quiet on that mountain, all you hear are your footsteps in the snow and maybe a little wind. My brother had no idea he was right behind him. Australian here, so substitute woods for bush and wetland. Anyway, I have quite a few tales, most from when I was younger, but the ones that stick with me the most are the foxes. In Australia, foxes are an imported pest species, and near where I live, there's a massive swathe of land with a few families of foxes. They're all mangy as hell and probably inbred or something. Anyway, they do a lot of weird stuff. This story isn't really about them, though. One time I was out jogging, and every few minutes I'd see a shape dart across the track to the other side and disappear into the foliage. Creepy, but I figured it was just one of the foxes following me or something. I kept jogging, and then I hit a certain point in the track where I usually turn and head back. As I did, I saw the shape pretty clearly, and it looked kind of long for a fox. Great, I thought. Creepy giant foxes. Just what we need, and kept jogging. Then a few minutes later, something darted across the track again, and I got that cold feeling when you realize something is very wrong. Because the thing that darted across the track this time paused, and it was very clearly a fox. And a damn sight smaller than the thing that I'd seen a few times. So what the FCK was following me? This is the part where I wish I'd tangled it and held it for scientific examination, but I was freaked. It was at least 3 or 4 times bigger than a fox, now that I had a point of reference. So I exercised the better part of my courage and went into a dead-long sprint. After a second or two, I pulled my earphones out and kept running, and I realized I could hear the occasional rustle behind me. I'm guessing the fact that I just randomly broke out into a sprint gave me a head start. Anyway, I made it to a well-lit area by a main road, stopped, and looked. I could see some shadowy thing in the distance, but it wasn't following. I have this cool cap I wear while jogging that has small lights set in the brim. I flicked them on and tried to point them, but the thing was too far away. I still couldn't make it out, but it was freaking me out how it just watched me. I walked along the road until I exited the wetland and went home. I used to hike around there regularly, and I still do semi-regularly, but stuff started to make sense when I realized there was something out there. Like why my dog used to be on high alert at night and stay within a few meters of me, when during the day he'd just run around until I called him. My brother is a national park ranger. He only had one weird experience in Big Bend National Park. He and his roommate had the exact same dream, being chased through the mountains by a large black bull. It turns out the canyon he was staying in is haunted by a witch who takes the form of a bull. It's called Brujas Canyon or something. Google it, I guess. He says a lot of weird stuff happens in the Southwest, though, and his fellow rangers who have worked in the NPS for a while have some good stories. One season he was working at Arches in Utah, and his friend and fellow ranger had taken a kayaking trip somewhere in that area of Utah. One night, while sleeping by the banks of the river, she had a very vivid dream of something walking in the water outside her tent. She went outside to check, and there was a naked woman in the river. This woman then jumped on his friend and started choking her so violently that when she woke up, she was still seriously gasping for breath. The next morning, she checked outside her tent, and there were cougar tracks everywhere. She talked to a native friend about this, and it turns out skinwalkers will turn into cougars and hang out in that section of the river. Apparently, she's lucky to be alive. My brother said the fear of skinwalkers is so alive in those native communities that when he would visit schools to give talks, he would have to refrain from talking about certain animals because they're commonly associated with skinwalkers. Owls and cougars, apparently. He also said there are quite a few NPS rangers who believe in Bigfoot. Not that he's a real ape, but some kind of forest spirit. I was solo kayak camping in the North Woods in Ontario, Canada, last summer, lakeside. Very quiet night. It was around midnight or so, and I was trying to get to sleep. I heard some massive crackling in the woods that I could swear was bipedal, but of course I couldn't be 100% sure. Something was walking around about 50 to 75 feet away. I was creeped out. Suddenly I heard, and felt, a huge kerplunk splash in the water about 30 to 50 feet away from my tent on the water. It was like a huge rock lobbed into the water. Too scared to go out and investigate, I washed down a couple tranks with a huge slug of JD and passed out soon afterwards. Yikes. A friend and I were hiking the woods behind our church. The church sat on about 40 acres, hoping to sneak up on the youth group and prank them. I got a little lost and decided to turn back. We were hiking back through a clearing running through the woods made for high-tension power lines to take the easy way back. It was getting darker as we were walking, and at one point I thought I heard something in the woods to our left, so we stopped. We didn't hear much, so we continued. I should point out that we were a few hundred yards from the nearest street or building. A few minutes later, I thought I heard something again, so we stopped and heard what sounded like a two-legged creature swishing through the grass and underbrush. I couldn't see anything, though. We kept walking and stopped again a couple minutes later, and the sound was closer. We called out and got no answer, and we still couldn't see anything moving. We walked a little way farther and stopped to listen again, and the sound was even closer, but we still couldn't see anything. I shined a flashlight around, but nothing. We decided to just make a run for it at that point and get out of there. We both agreed that it sounded like something with 2 legs, not 4. We both heard it. Neither of us saw it. Neither of us heard a response to our calling out. I never figured out what it was. It might have been something with 4 legs after all, a mountain lion maybe. Might have been a junkie. It might have been a Sasquatch for all I know. My family takes a camping trip to this reservoir every August. We always camp in the same spot. One year, we arrived, set up our pop-up trailer, and got settled. I was 8 years old at the time. I did what felt natural to me and started snooping around camp to see what had changed since last year while my parents prepped dinner. There was a big pine tree on the far side of camp, close to the steep path down to the beach. I was playing over there, looking for a walking stick to help me down the steep path, when I noticed a perfect-looking one leaning against the trunk of the pine tree. I walked over to it and measured its height. It was a little tall for me, but I thought it would work fine. That's when I noticed the natural fiber thread tied to the top of it, with beads and feathers dangling from it. Pretty normal walking stick stuff from some kind of creative type. That wasn't the weird part. At the end of the thread was a small chunk of tough flesh, like the remains of an umbilical cord or maybe an infant's or animal's penis. The sight of it made my heart sink. I showed my mom, and she told me to put it back where I found it. We spent the rest of our camping trip in peace, but I did have some weird nightmares while we were there. I'm a hunter, hiker, and camper. I don't usually spook too easily because I basically grew up with a gun in one hand, a fishing pole in the other. I hunt in MN in a town not far north of Mill Lacs Lake. One season I was fairly deep in the woods on a snowmobile trail. When I hunt I typically carry my .30-06 and my knife in pack. I feel fairly confident in the woods, but this season I had some concern. The deer population seemed lower on our property recently, and we knew there were wolves around because you can hear them howl at night and have found tracks, but they typically don't mess with people luckily. But as I was scanning for deer tracks in the dirt, I found a different set of tracks that stood out to me, looked canine minus the nail marks and was a bit wider. The paw on it looked like a 150 pounds animal. Then it clicked that this was a feline track, a big one, and fairly fresh. I knew there were bobcats around, but they don't get that big, and next logical step is to assume that there is a cougar around. Now I decided to double back, so I'm heading back east on the trail and my dad calls and asks me to do a push through the woods towards his stand, so I say sure. At this point his stand is maybe 500 meters through thick woods from me, and I'm concerned about predators, but I also know that I'm 6 feet 4 inches and about 190 pounds before putting on my gear, and that statistically speaking cougars don't tend to attack healthy adult men. So I push forward. I get about halfway to the other stand and get concerned because I lost my marker, so I stop to regain my bearings. Then it hits me. My gut tells me you are being watched. Then I notice how still the woods are, very quiet. Then I hear a branch snap behind me by maybe 20 meters. I ready my rifle and scan in a circle and only see trees and brush. I wait and it's just quiet, so I push forward towards my dad's stand. I think. The whole time I hear something not far behind me quietly keeping pace. Eventually I stopped hearing it and the woods went back to normal with the birds singing and whatnot. Then I stepped out onto a trail about 40 meters from my dad's stand. I suspect it was the cougar that made the tracks. My guess is he or she thought I would put up too much of a fight for prey, or it winded my dad and chose to back off, but I never did see it. But something definitely was following me. This happened around June or July of 2007, I believe. I was around 17 years old and more cocky then, but still somewhat knowledgeable of the outdoors. My family used to own a cabin in NW, Wisconsin. I basically grew up there in the summer. I knew the woods well, but at night it was wise to stay in the cabin or at least by the bonfire by the beach because of bears, wolves, and cougars. One of the creepiest things was that if you were having a bonfire, the tree line was visible from the fire pit and beach, and at night you always felt like you were being watched from that tree line. But during the day, the woods always seemed normal, not so creepy, until this incident. So this happened somewhere between 1200 and 1400. Me and my cousin were having an airsoft battle. I was in full woodland camo, he was not. I retreated onto the ATV trail into the woods for a tactical advantage, and our battle took us about 200 meters into about a third of the way up the trail. We had enough at this point and were standing at the edge of a clearing on the trail talking, and he was maybe 10 feet from me. When I decided to mess with him, I shushed him and said we're being watched. He froze. Then I realized the woods were dead quiet, and I got spooked and started scanning the tree line and the other edge of the clearing from left to right when I saw it. Its teeth gave it away. It was panting and staring at my cousin. I don't expect you to believe me, but what I saw was a wolf as big as a black bear, at least 300 pounds, but it wasn't normal. This wolf was on 2 legs crouching next to a tree with its arm grasping the tree with a clawed hand. It had reddish-brown fur. I told my cousin that we have to go, and next thing I know he is sprinting, and I looked back at Wolfie, who had locked on and sprinted a few steps on 2 feet, and then I turned and ran when it looked like Wolfie was dropping to all fours. It charged us and sounded right on our asses barreling through the brush, but for whatever reason let us go when we broke out of the tree line and headed for the cabin. What stuck with me the most was the sheer size. Wolfie appeared to be nearly 7 tall when upright, and where it should have had front paws, it appeared to have large clawed hands. Now I'm not sure how to explain it away rationally. I have heard wolves will occasionally kind of walk upright, but as far as I know, they can't sprint on 2 legs, nor do wolves get that big, and black bears more often waddle on 2 legs. The closest description is silly, like a werewolf or dogman. I was out hunting with my dad. My uncle needed help a few miles away from our spot, and since we had gotten huge deer out of there before, I said I'd stay and just watch and wait for something to walk out. My dad left, and it was quiet out, kind of early, maybe 6 a.m., we got out there at 4. I decided to walk along the tree line because, why not? When I came upon this big clearing about 50 feet in. There was a lot of old lumber equipment, like the stuff you see in the pictures from the 20s in old logging towns. My dad works at a mill, and out of all the times I have visited his work, I have never seen any of this stuff. The moment I stepped foot into the clearing, it fell silent. Air was heavy, your chest felt like there was weight in your lungs. I couldn't even hear the wind, and the fog was avoiding the area. There are obvious footprints all over the ground, like men had been working. I was terrified but couldn't help but walk further in. I was looking at an old piece of equipment when I heard the very distinct sound of a tree falling. The ground even shook, with loud thundering footsteps right after, like someone was hauling asses to the clearing. It got louder and louder, and I was terrified. The air got heavier, and I couldn't breathe. It felt like the air was pushing down on me, making it hard to move. I heard muffled yelling, and that snapped me out of it, and I thought it was my dad. I booked it back to the tree line. I could suddenly breathe. But no, Dad. The landing was empty. So I turned back around and walked to the clearing, don't ask me why, and it's gone. Just trees. No equipment. There are no logs lying around. The sounds of nature were back. I cannot explain it. I never told anyone. I didn't think anyone would believe me. I was on a late night hike with my dad, his friend, and his friend's son. His son and I went to a broken, old restroom made of stone. It looked spooky, but I didn't really mind. I was the older one and couldn't look spooked. The kid starts peeing in a stone hole in the ground. I'm just waiting until some rocks fall and catch my attention. That's when I heard shuffling outside. I saw a hole in the wall and stepped forward a bit when I saw what looked like eyes. I told the kid to finish, grabbed the sharpest rock I could find, and asked who was out there. That's when the kid realized I was acting strange. He wanted to go back to his dad, so I called our dads and received no response. I didn't know what to do, it could be a prank for all I know. I quietly told the kid that when I opened the door, he should run down the trail back to the car, not look back, and that I'd be right behind him. I opened the door, he ran, and I was right on his back. I looked back and the bushes started shuffling like someone was running towards us. I accidentally dropped the rock, so now we could only run. We passed a bridge, and I saw nothing behind us. I saw 2 lights ahead. It was our dads, they had left us to smoke some weed. I told my dad that we needed to go. He thought I was about to get sick, so he said okay. We never told our dads what happened. So a couple years ago, before COVID, my brother took a 3-month job at a large national park in the Pacific Northwest. For everyone's info, if you're under a certain pay level, G's level, I think it's called, in the NPS, it's very common to bounce around to different parks every season. Once you're more experienced, you can apply for more permanent work. That's why he's worked at 5 or 6 parks. Anyway, his job was to help plant trees in this area that had been logged at one point. He was working with a small team, a couple of whom were experienced biologists who'd worked in the park for decades. One night after work, he asked kind of jokingly if they'd seen Bigfoot or Sasquatch in all their years working. They got kind of quiet and basically admitted they had one weird experience. 2 of his co-workers were doing field work on an old logging road in the backcountry of the park. The road ran parallel to a river. One day when they were driving along, they saw on the opposite side of the river what looked like, and I quote, a very tall man, head to toe in black, wearing what they thought at first was a hoodie. Apparently, upon seeing their car, this thing took off after them. What scared my brother's friends was that they were going relatively fast in the car, and this thing was running parallel to them across the river and was keeping up with them. It was jumping over logs and big rocks and moving like a human, not another animal. His friends don't like talking about it because, first, it scared the snot out of them. Secondly, these are very successful biologists in their field. I guess they don't want everyone to think they're nuts because they had a run-in with Bigfoot. I was a ranger who specialized in crocodile relocation. Somebody rings the council and says they saw a crocodile. The council calls us, and we go set a trap nearby. We set a trap in a notorious river with a lot of big crocs. A few days later, we go back to check it. Somewhere along the river, the telltale on the outboard stopped flowing. The skipper hauls the motor up out of the water, and I clamber out to the prop to check what's going on. It was just a big bit of crud in the inlet, so there I am, hanging off the side of the boat, inches from the water, hard at work digging this little bit of stuff out of the tube, when something big came out of the water right under my face. Remember, this is a river with some nasty, big bastards in it. Well, I nearly walked on water at that point. Luckily, some part of my brain decided that water was bad and chose return to boat instead. I can tell you it wasn't a voluntary action. It was fight or flight, and I wasn't going to engage in an altercation with some behemoth from the murky depths. So now I'm sprawled in the boat, half soaked from the splash of the behemoth's eruption, and wondering what the duck just happened. The skipper was a bit dumbfounded, and the bastard sea turtle that breached next to my ducking boat went about its day unperturbed. I was off-roading with some buddies back home in eastern New Brunswick on the Bay of Fundy, and this trail we do ends on the water, and it's the site of an old ammunition depot from World War II. We've been here many times during the day, sometimes at night. You can drive into and through this massive old structure, and up the hill is the administration building for said site from World War II. It's pretty far in the woods, and at the very top of that hill are some grave markers from hundreds of years ago that we were told are old pirate graves. We live on the coast, not at all something I doubt being real. We were in there one night in the big building having a fire, and we all saw and heard something quite large scramble up the side of the building and start running on top of it. Now, there's a dozen of us there, so clearly it's not just one person seeing something crazy. There is nothing in the woods of eastern Canada that should be able to climb as quick as what we saw, a black bear, maybe, but this thing basically ran up the side of this 4-story tall structure and then ran across the top in moments. We got in our trucks and hightailed it out of there. On another occasion, we were exploring the administration building, which is a 3-story concrete building that has been abandoned since World War II. We went all the way to the top, nothing weird. Coming back, an entire room on the 2nd story was filled with lit candles, but there was no one around whatsoever. Again, we ran the F out of there. Now this one, I will admit, was probably an elaborate prank since lots of people would go duck around there since it was a fun off-road trail with some history at the end of it, but the animal climbing shit we saw still mystifies me to this day. I'm a farmer. The scariest thing was that I was on my way home from being out of town one night when my dad called and asked if I could shut some irrigation valves off. Basically, like shutting off a water faucet at the start of each row, we usually ran like 20 to 30 at a time. I didn't have a flashlight, so I just pulled my pickup up to the first valve and shut them off with the light from the headlights. I get about halfway down when it goes kind of dark, and I whip around to notice something tall enough to reach the headlights completely blocked out the passenger side light, and just as I caught it, it crossed over to block the driver's side light before moving along. Like 3 seconds in all and never made a sound. I talked myself into it being a big coyote. The most unnerving thing was actually planting trees in broad daylight with my dad. We farm along a river, and a group of stray dogs were attacking something in the water from a distance. We've had our dogs attacked a few times, and my mom falls to pieces each time, so it caught my attention pretty quickly, and I thought it might be one of our dogs being drowned. I banged on the side of the truck and yelled at my dad to reverse up the river bank, which he did. I get close enough to throw a decent-sized rock at the dogs, which eventually causes them to scatter. The poor dog getting attacked kind of struggled over to the bank opposite of me and jumped out about 10 feet away. And it's not a dog I've ever seen. It rises out of the water and partially stumbles into a bush before pausing and looking back at me. It's completely hairless, about chest length, almost like a dog with mange or something, but it has very spindly, undog-like legs like a deer. Somewhat of a dog's head, but the proportions were all slightly off. Like it had a big rectangular snout, much too block-shaped for a dog. Big ears that stood straight up like an alert dog but were just a little too big to look natural. It stumbled into some thicker brush, and I jumped back into the truck, and my dad and I both just kind of said, "What the duck was that?" He got on a big chupacabra kick for like 2 months after that, which I admit, so some of the depictions do kind of look like what I saw. But really, I still have no idea what it was. I think something was just sick and mangy enough that I couldn't quite recognize it. Not super scary, but definitely weird. My grandpa had a farm with free-range cattle. He had a massive property. We didn't always see the cows every day, they'd go off in the fields in little groups. We knew they were out there, but they just did their own thing. We visited the farm one day, and my grandparents weren't home. They always had a spare key hidden on the porch in case a family member was visiting and they weren't around. Well, my mom unlocked the door, and the alarm went off. It was loud. Because they're in the country, the alarm was made to sound like a siren to alert the closest neighbors. It echoed all over the fields. We were in the house, calling family members on their rotary phone, lol, I love that phone, trying to figure out how to shut off the alarm. Then I looked out the window. The cows. Cows from all directions are running towards us. I had never seen them run like this. They were running at full speed, every single one. Then they stopped. They formed a circle around the entire house, standing shoulder to shoulder. They just stood there staring at us. It was so weird, I wish I had a photo, but this was before cameras were super accessible. They stayed there until my grandpa showed up, then they dispersed. Like his big security guards or something. My family always had cattle growing up. We ran them in different lots depending on how many we had and what land we were leasing, but they were typically in wooded pastures down the main road from our house in either direction. One small pasture where we ran cattle was up against an 80-acre lot that was heavily wooded. Undeveloped, no roads, no trails, nothing. And this ran up against Corps of Engineers land. Anyway, it was often enough that we'd be tending to the cattle there in some way, and they'd be spooked by something in the woods. They'd put a good distance between themselves and the fence line and stand in a rough line, staring at the woods. This would have been during the day or in the evening, and we'd most often be on a tractor loading feeders. So, making a ton of noise, whatever was scaring the cattle wasn't intimidated by us at all. We didn't talk about it, but it seemed odd even when I was a kid, and I hated when it would happen. Intense feeling of being watched and feeling the need to always keep an eye on the fence line. We never lost anything to predators. We didn't have bears or mountain lions there, though I heard young males would sometimes pass through. Coyotes would be way too shy for the noise and activity. It was random when it would happen, but consistent through my childhood in this pasture. I had no idea what was going on. Oh man, I've got a good one. Most people probably won't believe it, but I swear it's the truth. Had a horse farm that bordered a vast forest and a well-known river in East Tennessee. Didn't do much farming there. Some vegetables, mostly stabled and raised quarter horses anyway. I had 4 younger brothers and a neighbor who was a couple years older than me. This was the early 1990s, and all we did was hunt those woods and duck around exploring all the time. We weren't supposed to cross the culvert of the river into TWRA land, mostly because we weren't supposed to hunt there and our parents didn't want us getting into trouble. One day, when I was like 13, we stopped going there for a different reason. We were way deeper into that part of the forest than we were supposed to be. Further than we had ever been before when one of my brothers noticed a pine thicket that had a bunch of trees, 14-footers, that were broken off at about 8 feet and all laying pointed deeper into the woods. It was just a small stand of pines, but I'd say there were 24 trees all snapped off and pointed in the same direction. My first instinct when I saw those trees was absolute dread. I knew that wasn't natural, and I wanted the duck out of there. My neighbor was a complete psychopath. I always thought he had a death wish. He wanted to explore the timber that was across a small clearing where this abnormality was pointing. Something in me was screaming to get the hell out of there, but he and 2 of my younger brothers were determined to see what was beyond that small clearing. About the time we crossed into the clearing, we heard what sounded like someone coming through the woods where we had just been. At this point, I was completely terrified, and my neighbor and brothers were laughing at me, calling me a pussycat, and, just giving me absolute hell about it. When they walked back towards the pine thicket, I went wide and took a long way around back to the trail that would take me to where I wanted to be. My position, having backtracked, had me about 50 yards from them and that thicket, but I could see them. All of a sudden I hear screaming, see my neighbor come flying through the air, and hear my brothers yelling and crying and heading my way. At first, I didn't see it, but after this thing, oh my god. It still unnerves me. This thing let out a scream that you felt more than you heard. It had to be 10 feet tall. Human looking and covered with jet black hair. At this point, we were all running for our lives, and this thing didn't give chase. We ran for what seemed like miles, and when we couldn't anymore, we all collapsed on the ground, just on the line for our property. We were all hysterical, but this thing had picked up my neighbor and launched him 20 feet in the air. It broke his collarbone and everything else. As we were composing ourselves, we heard that damn scream again. And it was close. We never saw it again, but it got its point across. We never went back there again. We didn't tell our parents what happened until about 2 years ago. I'm 41 years old, and our neighbor to this day refuses to talk about it. We told our parents that he fell out of a tree, and we all got scared that day. What were we supposed to tell them? That a Sasquatch threw Jason like a baseball and he broke his collarbone? Anyway, that's my buried trauma from childhood. My great uncle was a trapper in Louisiana for many years and used to tell me all types of stories as a kid. There was always one that stood out to me. He used to tell me, "Boy, I never told you the story of how I saw the Rougarou." Well, I was out at the bayou fishing and I couldn't have been more than 20, when all manner of creature, bird, deer, and raccoon just running in one direction. It looked like one of them disaster movies. Then the whole swamp went quiet, and it ain't never quiet in the swamp, boy. Out of nowhere, this creature, about 7 feet tall, came into my view, walking across the other side of the bayou. I couldn't move, I was frozen in fear, and then he stopped and looked at me. He looked dead at me. I jumped up so damn fast that I almost fell in the water. I ran straight home, never looked back, never ran that fast in my life, left my rod, my rifle, and everything out there. He isn't the only one in my family that's seen it. My grandfather and grandmother have both seen and shot at it, and other family members have seen it around our town too. I'm from a very small town in the middle of nowhere in Louisiana. In the Shoshone Forest region of Wyoming, my dad and I were up there. There are the remains of a ranch that was owned by Amelia Earhart, as well as an abandoned mining town called Kerwin. We were up there exploring, and I rounded the corner of a doorway and heard a loud, massive scramble and saw movement out of the corner of my eye. It was a moose. It was hanging out in the cabin, and the back wall had partially collapsed, so it was an open shelter for it. Here's the strange part for me, I never actually saw the moose. I was within a few feet of it. Had it bolted my way, I would have been in a world of hurt, but it all happened so fast and unexpectedly that I never actually saw it. I just heard it and noticed movement in the grass. The only way I knew it was a moose was because my dad saw it and told me. He was in a position to see the moose leave from the far side of the cabin, and because I heard it, a massive sound of an animal taking off. That something so big could disappear into the woods so fast continues to amaze me. I grew up on the west side of Cincinnati, and near my house, between two arterial roads, Harrison Avenue and Queen City. If you're from the area, there is a miles-long patch of forested land that I presume is just too hilly to develop, and if you stayed parallel to the main roads, it had a wilderness feel to it. But urban too, there were a couple abandoned train trestles, burned out cars, lots of graffiti, and some amazing BMX and mountain biking downhill runs. Needless to say, as a boy, I spent a huge amount of time out there. Anyway, one time a buddy of mine and I were back there and came across what I can only describe as the entire contents of a house just dumped in the woods, literally including the kitchen sink. So we set up all the furniture like a house in the woods, with dolls in chairs, etc., and even set the table. I climbed a few trees and dressed the trunks in hoodies, shirts, and dresses. I like to think that someone else came along and was weirded out by it, but probably not. I just started doing owl surveys for the Forest Service. This means going out into the forest after last light, playing an owl call, and just standing there for 10 minutes waiting for a response. You have a headlamp and a flashlight. You can see what you choose to see in front of you, but every time you move your head or hand, you cause the shadows to move, and you fear that you will uncover something that will freak you out. So standing in one place is usually the best bet to calm your nerves. However, you have to get to the survey area first. So me and my partner were driving in the pitch black through these unpaved roads, moving slowly. All we see is the rough road illuminated in front of us and the occasional memory of a turn or landmark from reconfiguring the roads during the day. I look to my side and see what I think is a stand of trees, only to realize a moment later that it is actually a tall bluff. I continue on, and I see a disused mattress on the side of the road. We are 5 to 10 miles from the closest town on Forest Service roads that no one uses. Further along, I see what I think is another turnoff with a stand of trees in the distance. At the edge of the turnoff are a few dented metal boxes. Next to the boxes are two glowing objects. The lights begin to move as we pass. It's not movement from the wind. It's too bright to be a reflection from our headlights. All of a sudden, I see the whole object lurch up with the two lights in the middle of it and realize they are eyes. The creature starts rising up towards the edge of the clearing. I can't believe what I'm seeing. It seems to me to have the body shape of a deer, even though my partner shouts out that it's a mountain lion. It starts rising in the air. What? Are my eyes deceiving me? I realize from the motion that there must be another bluff at the side of the clearing instead of trees. I keep driving, trying to hide my fear so my partner doesn't get spooked. On our way back, my partner asks if we want to go check out the clearing again. Nope. I don't even merit answering the question with a reply. Around 6 years ago, my buddies and I had a little tradition during our senior year of high school where we'd stay out all night skating or exploring all kinds of spooky areas. And this was before any of us had a car, so everything was traveled by foot. One night in particular, We ventured out over an hour from our usual exploration areas, and we came across a heavily wooded area that we hadn't been through before. The time had to have been around 2 or 3 a.m., and just looking into those woods gave me an incredible feeling of unease that I had never felt before. My buddies were determined to go through it, but I decided against it and instead told my friends that I'd just skate or walk around and meet them at the gas station on the other side. It took me around 30 minutes to skate around the entire area. I waited at the exit of the woods for about 15 minutes before crossing the 4-lane street that led to the gas station. I asked the clerk if 3 guys and another teen had come in. He told me no, so I headed back out to wait in the front. 10 more minutes passed before I can hear heavy footsteps moving quickly from behind the gas station's main building. Next thing I know, I see all 3 of my buddies, sweaty, out of breath, and looking like they've witnessed a murder. We head into the gas station and sit in the small seating area. They then go on to tell me that somewhere halfway into those woods they heard strange noises behind them, and when they turned around to look, they saw a tall, white figure with red eyes staring at them. They said they freaked out and just took off. As they neared the end of the woods, they could hear the leaves and branches rustling as if they were chasing them. They kept running until they crossed the road separating the woods from the gas station, and once they were at the back of the gas station, they looked back and could see the figure just standing at the edge of the woods, unmoving. The way they described it was that it was only vaguely shaped like a human, more like a Sasquatch or Bigfoot type creature, but it was white in color and had piercing red eyes. Honestly, I had never seen anyone so distressed in the way that my friends were. They genuinely seemed terrified, and that night was one of the last times they ever wanted to stay out all night. I think about this night a lot, even to this day. I live in a 600-year-old farmhouse in Sweden. Being old as shit, it has its fair share of creepiness. Sometimes I hear screaming from the fields and woods, but I assume it's the foxes and wolves that live nearby. This is not about that, though. We have an unused upstairs room. It was a guest room for the last family that lived here. We simply bought a new mattress for the bed frame and left it alone. The upstairs has no plumbing or heating, so we don't use it for anything but storage. During the summer, my partner came over to live with us for a few weeks. We prepared the guest room for them and decided that I and they would sleep there together. They started having conversations with something in their sleep. A few times we slept in other rooms, and this never occurred then. They'd mumble yes, no, and are you sure? What do you mean? Are you all right? So on. At first, I thought it was because it was a new bed and a new place, so it might have disturbed something in their sleep. But it never stopped. No matter how many nights we spent there. One time they opened their eyes, looked at me, and said, "We need to deliver him." They could not recall this the morning after. What the duck this meant, I have no idea. I wish I had some climactic ending or solution, but I've been too much of a pussycat to go into that room alone since. I don't know why, it just creeped me the duck out. We had a small herd of Herefords, mostly cows and yearlings, and one morning when I was putting up temporary fencing to put them in a new field, I saw the whole damned herd racing out of the wooded river bottom, just hauling. These guys are some pretty placid cows, polled Herefords. I dunno how the horned one acts as I never had any, but this terror dash was unlike them. It's Northeast Ohio, no bears around here save the occasional juvenile male, no cougars, no stupid hunters, even. I see them freaking out and immediately feel protective, so I start heading down to where they've stopped in a tight, crowded circle. They were intent, staring at me from whence they'd come, and as I hopped fences to run down the cow trail that scrolled down the hillside, something about their body postures suddenly froze my blood. Our bull was among them, every bit as frightened as the rest, and he's a great big boy, one of the biggest bulls we'd ever had. He wasn't afraid of shit. But whatever had spooked them was enough to drive this giant dude, who feared neither man nor beast nor farm equipment, into a defensive posture that sent me skidding to a stop. To hell with investigating. I was unarmed, I hadn't even brought a fence post with me. And as I scanned the trees, I felt something watching them and me. It wasn't a scary cat moment for me, as when I felt the eyes on me, the cow sensed it too, stamping, snorting, and wheeling. I walked, eyes locked on those trees, to my herd. After a while, the sense of mortal danger left, and the cows went back to grazing. But what the duck? I live in a small town in southern Ontario, Canada. We have lots of gullies and thinner stretches of woods, creeks, and street runoff. Now, me and my girlfriend at the time were at her parents' house. They were out of town for, I think, the whole weekend. So we decide to go outside to stargaze at the perfectly clear night. 9:30, 10 p.m., maybe a bit later, her parents' house is right next to an open field that is surrounded by a gully or forest area. Not many neighbors, dead-end street, only one street light. Great for stargazing. So we are both out there sitting on a concrete construction roadblock, the huge ones, just looking up and talking. 20 minutes and half an hour go by. It's really quiet. I get a feeling, not a feeling of being watched, just like a you need to look around feeling. So I'm looking around, and then I see it. A shadowy shape about 40 feet away. I think it's no biggie, just a dark bush. Look at it in different ways and come back to the shadow and how it's moving. Like towards us. I'm thinking, oh, my eyes and brain are crazy tonight. I'm not one to freak out quickly. But then I notice my girlfriend is staring at it too. She goes, "Did you see that?" Me, "Yeah, I see a weird shadow on a bush." Her, "No, it's moving." I see it moving too. So we both watch. No wind, no noise of grass moving or animals moving around. Then it didn't really change shape as much as we both realized it was in a stalking crouch. Sneaking directly towards us. Stalking us. By now, it's 20 or less feet away. I know I'm not crazy because my girlfriend notices it as well. Then we get this feeling of dread. At the same time, we both say we need to go. So we do a quick walk backwards, kind of walking back towards the house. Get there and go upstairs to GF's parents' room. The window looks directly out over the field. We didn't take more than 30 seconds, maybe 45, to get to the window. Nothing there. Sleep was hard that night. Nothing was there the next morning. The sun is shining, so we figure, let's go look for tracks or find the bush we overreacted to. No bush, no footprints in any of the mud that's right in line with where we saw it. I have no idea what we saw, but no more late night stargazing there. There was no way it was a deer. And deer are probably the biggest animals around here. Definitely not a dog. Not my story, but girlfriend's. Her and a few friends, 2 gals and a guy, went camping to a remote place in the woods for fun. It was like a little turnout near a random Forest Service road. The guy friend, whom I will refer to as Manly Man, was actually a scared twip and hated sleeping in the woods, but for whatever reason loved being out there. In order to alleviate his fears, he brought a dose of sleeping aid, either Ambien or OTC Benadryl, I don't remember. Fast forward to around dusk, and they are enjoying a fire and generally jesting when a truck rolls up. Lifted, loud, you know the type. One guy gets out of the passenger door, another stays in the cab. They want directions to somewhere that no one has heard of and want to use a phone since they have no service. After being told that no one else has service, he proceeds to ask questions like, "Just you 4 up here? Did you know there are bears? Which there aren't, in the Oregon Valley. Are you carrying any protection from wild animals?" Rather annoying and innocuous stuff, until. Fast forward again to the middle of the night when Manly Man has thoroughly knocked the duck out and headlights pop up on the road. An engine rolls closer, and my girlfriend wakes up, spooked. Engine stops, headlights cut. There was no noise for a couple minutes, then rustling. GF wakes the girls up, and they all start freaking out and trying to rouse Manly Man. Eventually he wakes up and groggily agrees that the rustling is real. He is a bit nervous. They listen for a while longer, and after the noise gets closer, they start shouting out who's there and all that. No answer. Rustling stops. Needless to say, they threw their camping stuff in the trunk and went home. They passed, the same truck a bit down the road, no one inside. Either those pricks were playing a prank or legit up to shitty things, but either way, that's not how you want to be woken up. They ended up crashing at Manly Man's house in the living room and playing Risk the next day. A year ago, my grandfather in Malaysia died. Malaysian tradition is that you have to look over the body at all times until it is buried or cremated. I think that this was to stop any evil spirits from possessing the body. Now, my grandfather was, essentially, a bad man. He was a pretty powerful member of the trades back then and got most of my uncles into it. He was a great family man, though, and he treated all of us with kindness and respect. His body was in his house, which was basically bordered by a forest. Now, as he was a triad chief, there were over 50 armed men there and a lot of relatives either sleeping in the house or on the massive lawn. All the forest had in terms of wildlife were snakes, monkeys, and wild boars. Nothing is too dangerous or scary. Or so I thought. The day after we first arrived, some of the men found a monkey on the outskirts of the forest. Dead. Its stomach had been completely ripped open, as had its face. I'll never forget its face. It had such a human look of terror that it will haunt me forever. The really creepy part was that there was barely any blood on the ground where it was. That meant that someone or something had killed it somewhere else and placed it there for us to find. That night, I drew guard duty for the night. This basically meant that myself and some other men had to babysit my grandfather's coffin. Creepy, right? Anyway, that night was weird. Like all forests, you'll hear noises like monkeys screaming, bird calls, etc. It was completely goddamn silent. It scared the snot out of me. Heck, it scared the guys who I was with, who were armed literally to the teeth and were probably serious criminals and maybe murderers. At around 3 a.m., these two guys wanted to go outside for a smoke. I was kind of bored, but I decided to join them. I remember before I left, one of the older men there called me over and handed me A.22. He told me that the forest didn't seem right tonight, to be careful, and that it was loaded. I had learned to shoot before, but this was only the second or third time that I had handled a gun outside of a shooting range, so I walked out into the quiet night with these two guys. There were actually a few people around, but like us, they were kind of freaked out by the forest. Anyway, I was walking slightly behind them, a rifle hanging on my shoulder and a torch in my hand. They were just shooting the shit and lighting up when I heard the noise. It sounded like a huge man was running through thick branches, but it seemed to be coming from the trees. I ran up to the guys, and they had heard it too. These tough gangsters looked like pedos on their first day in general prison. One of them, white-faced, pointed at a spot high up on a tree. This thing was standing on a branch. It looked like an orangutan, with really long hair and stuff, but it was standing completely upright. It was huge as well. More than 6 feet at least. But its eyes. I'll never forget its eyes. They glowed a dull red, and the longer I stared at him, the more depressed and sad I became. I had an urge to walk into the forest and leave everything behind forever. I had taken a step forward when one of the guys started shooting. He was crying, chanting Buddhist verses, and basically screaming at the thing. I don't know whether he hit it or not, but the thing just vanished. We hightailed it back to the house, but we never saw it again. When we told everyone what we saw, they just became really quiet and refused to talk about it further. My mom and I left that afternoon. Later, I learned that the two guys had died quite recently. Although I haven't been back to that place since that happened, I always hear stories about how that place doesn't feel right and that occasionally a dead animal will turn up in the front yard. I wasn't a ranger or anything, but I worked for a ski resort in Colorado for a couple years. At one of the places I worked, my boss and I rode snowmobiles up the Gulch Road every day to get to the restaurant we worked at. Anyway, we saw a couple things that were out of the ordinary. Coming down the road one afternoon, a couple miles down, we found a little girl sitting on the side of the road, barefoot in the snow. Apparently, she had somehow managed to veer off the ski trails and ski down the road for a little bit. When she realized she was lost, she decided to walk. She walked for a while in her ski boots, but then I guess she figured she could walk faster barefoot? So she took off the boots and her socks and walked a good way barefoot. She was freezing and terrified when we found her. Poor thing. We radioed for ski patrol, wrapped her up in blankets, and gave her some hand warmers while we waited. Another thing we found wasn't creepy, but it was funny as hell. We came around a corner on the road, and off to the right side among some fallen trees was a mostly naked woman, bent over a log, with her mostly naked boyfriend or husband pounding away behind her. He waved, we laughed, waved, and kept going. My mom, one of my younger cousins, who was about 8, and I went up on a Thursday to set up camp for my dad, who was coming up the next day after work. We got our favorite spot, which was about 40 or 50 feet off the road. It was very secluded, with a small stream running through it, and everything seemed normal while we were setting up. It's known for being a party campsite since it's private and large. Once I found an old tent left unzipped with rainwater and little knickknacks inside at the back of the campsite. That wasn't too creepy, though. It was probably left by some hungover people. When it was time for bed, my mom decided that my cousin and I should sleep in her tent instead of sleeping in our own since my dad wasn't there. She cleaned up outside, put out the fire, and came to bed shortly after we did. It was peaceful, and we all fell asleep. I don't know what time I woke up because I didn't have a cell phone or anything. Something just pulled me out of sleep, possibly my mom snoring loudly next to me. I had been sleeping facing the side of the tent and rolled onto my back. That's when I noticed there was light outside. I was groggy, but I finally realized that the fire was going again. So I'm laying there wondering if my mom forgot to put it out, though I was fairly certain she had, and if I should go do it when I hear footsteps crunching the leaves outside of the tent. Mom is still snoring, and I'm freaking the duck out. I wait a minute and hear more of what sounded like heavy boots crunching leaves and sticks around our campsite. Shadows were dancing around because of the fire, so it was hard to tell what was out there. I sat up and quietly asked my cousin if he was awake, and hearing this, he said yes. My mom was still passed out. That's when I distinctly heard the other tent, technically what would have been our tent, being unzipped and zipped back up when I guess they realized no one was in it. I motioned to my cousin that we should just be quiet. I laid down and waited for a long time that felt like hours for them to come to ours next, but whomever or whatever it was didn't. At some point, I fell back asleep. I got up that morning and noticed that the fire grate was open, which is odd because my mom always closes it when she puts it out. When my cousin and I asked her about it, she gave me a weird look and said that she must have forgotten. I know my mom pretty well, and I felt like she was hiding something, so I waited for my cousin to be out of earshot and asked her again. She made me promise not to tell him, but she had definitely put the fire out and closed the grate. However, she hadn't woken up during the weirdness. I don't know what it was, I can't explain it, and it didn't happen again, but it was one of the strangest things I've ever experienced. I worked for the Park Service for 7 years. For one winter, I was stationed down in Kalalik at Olympic National Park. I was one of only 3 employees who had full-time employment during this time. I lived on the premises in a small apartment and would often walk over to the main building at night to work out at the gym. It was always empty at this time, nobody else stayed or lived there during the weekend. When I was done, I would make my rounds and ensure all the lights were out and the doors were locked. Outside one of the bunkhouses was an unfinished shed that had an overhead light. The control for the light was inside the shed and locked. I would turn that light off almost every night, only to find it on in the morning without fail. It wasn't on a timer. Nobody else was around who had access. I've spent my whole life working in the woods, and I'm completely at home when outside in the dark. I could not walk from my apartment to the main building at night without wanting to run every single time. Random employees would come to the bunkhouse throughout the winter to stay the night on weekdays while on assignment. Numerous employees complained of bumps in the night and odd noises. Some refused to stay on the second floor entirely. One man even saw an apparition disappear through the wall of his room and refused to stay there any longer. All came to me with their stories, unprompted, throughout the winter. I'm not a park ranger, but I spent a lot of time growing up in the mountains of northern Arizona. Me and 3 friends went out late one night. I must have been 16 or 17. We would often go into deep parts of the forest and smoke weed and hang out. This time around, we decided to go to a random spot way out of where we were used to going. We were probably a good 10 miles out from an area called Donnie Park in Flagstaff and found a spot super far into the woods where we could build a fire and smoke some bowls. 2 of my friends hopped out of the vehicle to take a pee while me and the other friend stayed in the car. We sat in silence for a short time before we heard tree branches snapping and the loudest crackling sound imaginable. It sounded just like the predator, and we looked at each other with absolute fear and confusion in our faces. Our other 2 friends hopped into the car almost simultaneously, and we all freaked out and started driving back to the road. While driving through the forest, we hit maybe 50 to 60 on dirt roads, and we still heard branches breaking and crackling. I was afraid for my life that night, but we finally made it back to the road and decided to call it a night as we were all too afraid to go back into a wooded area and smoke. I've had every denier tell me what animal it was or could have been, but after researching it for years, I still have yet to come across that sound coming from any known animal native to Flagstaff, Arizona. It was truly bone-chilling. On the other side, I've spoken with Native Americans, and the answers have been mixed. I've had answers from Wendigos to skinwalkers, even witches. A lot of spooky stuff has happened to me in the woods before. I even heard drums that came closer and closer after stopping in between, and eventually one loud one banged right in front of us. The scariest thing is that I was never alone for either of these. It involved multiple people who can retell the story word for word on how it happened. There is something strange going on in the woods of northern Arizona. I am 28 now, and this still gives me chills to this day. I used to live in the woods, literally in a log cabin. One afternoon, I wanted to go to my friend's house, which was less than a mile from mine. So a fairly short, easy walk along a small paved road, although with lots of switchbacks and turnoffs. Anyway, I stayed at his house past dark, which I was really not supposed to do, but it wasn't the end of the world either. Nonetheless, I realized I had better get home shortly after dark, so I started walking. After a few minutes, I became aware that it was getting harder to see, but I figured that no matter how dark it was, my eyes would eventually adjust, so I continued on down the road. Soon I found myself in pitch black. I held my hand up right in front of my face and could not see it. This was how I discovered that when you are out of reach of any lights, there is no moon, and the sky is very overcast, you can in fact find yourself with no light at all. I tried to look back towards my friend's house to see if I could see the lights from his parents' cabin. But I could not. Besides, without any point of reference, I wasn't even certain anymore that I was looking back or which way I was really looking at all. Now I wasn't truly lost, as I knew which road I was on and roughly where I was in relation to my own house. But I was far from certain I could find my way. I spent the next hour or so literally feeling my way along the ground with my hand to confirm there was still a paved road beneath my feet. Somehow, through a combination of luck and general knowledge of the features of the road, I made it far enough to bring my own porch light into sight. Here in Southern California, there is a private cemetery that holds about 20 to 30 souls. It is mostly one family from the early part of the 20th century, with the latest victim being buried in about 1958. I found this place by accident while walking my dogs and always thought of it as a novelty. There's a somewhat large city that surrounds it that is over 200,000 people, but very few know about it. Whenever I hike back here, I always carry a sidearm because of the coyotes, and I don't want them to bother my dogs because they're smaller dogs. This night I had gotten back from hiking around dusk, and it had gotten dark fast. I was putting my dogs back in the truck after walking them past the cemetery. It was then, as I was putting the last of the 3 dogs inside the back seat of my truck, that I noticed that they all started barking together like they were out of control. I did a quick scan and saw nothing, but they continued to bark. The second time I lifted my head up, I saw an animal coming down the trail towards the truck on 4 legs. It was a dark cat-like animal that looked similar to a jaguar, but it was not walking or behaving like a normal animal that I have seen in the wild before when camping, such as bears and cougars. Recognizing that this animal posed a threat, I immediately drew my pistol and fired a shot at it. This creature, or whatever it was, leapt over a 15-foot scrub oak like it was nothing. It would be like you and I walking over a blade of grass. Not knowing whether I hit the animal or not, I drew down for a second time but recognized that my downrange was a trailer park with people living in it. My dogs had not even been scared by the shot going off the first time, and realizing that this was not a place to be because it was getting dark, I left the area immediately in my truck. What had I seen? What could jump over a tree like that? Was this real or paranormal? To this day, it scares me thinking about this event, and I've never been back to the place where it occurred. I was 19. It was the summer after my first failed attempt at college, and I was back home trying to figure out what to do next and helping out on the farm. That week, we were baling hay. I drove the tractor, pulling a baler and a hay rack, while my dad pulled the bales from the baler and stacked them on the rack. Something jammed, and my dad was trying to fix it. I was kind of spaced out, gazing in the direction of a full rack of hay we had finished earlier. Then I see this guy, probably in his 60s, half bald, wearing sort of old-fashioned clothes, looking over the full rack of hay. My first thought was that an Amish guy had stopped by to talk to my dad, but then I realized he was clean-shaven when an Amish man of that age would have a beard. So that seemed odd. Also odd was that after he walked around a bit admiring the hay, he seemed to vanish while my head was turned. There was no truck, horse-drawn conveyance, tractor, or other method of transportation leaving, no person walking or running, and no cover close enough that he could have gotten to it in the time my head was turned, besides standing on the edge of the far side of the full hay rack, behind the hay. Which is where I figured he must be. It would be an odd thing to do, but there was nowhere else he could be. At that point, Dad had decided the baler needed to go back to the farm, and so we unhooked the half-full rack and pulled up to attach the full one to tow it back to the farm behind the baler. Meanwhile, I'm looking for this guy, and he isn't there. I scan the field and don't see anyone, and again, the nearest cover, the woods, was too far away for him to get there without being seen. I asked my dad if he saw him, but he was busy with the baler and not paying attention. This was about a year and a half ago. My fiancé and I were camping at Uwharrie National Forest for a weekend of off-roading. We set up our tent on the outskirts of a group campsite, somewhat far away from other tents and pretty close to the tree line. The first night passed without a hitch, but the second night I was woken up at about 3 a.m. by an absolutely disgusting noise. It sounded like a mix between a dog's reverse sneezing and a gagging noise. I could immediately tell it was an animal, but something was very wrong. The tent was pitch black, so I laid there in fear as the animal came right up to the side of the tent, walked around us, and then walked away. I could hear the noise continuing in the distance near the other campsites. My fiancée sleeps like the dead, but my dog was standing with her hackles raised, staring at the side of the tent while growling softly under her breath. Some time passed, probably like 20 minutes, but I don't remember exactly, and the sound started moving closer to the tent again. This time, I shook my fiancée awake, and we both lay there frozen as whatever it was circled our tent again while constantly making that awful noise. By this time, my dog was vibrating with growls, and I had to grab her to keep her from lunging at the side of the tent. Fortunately, the animal eventually wandered away into the woods, and I fell asleep again once my dog relaxed. We woke up pretty early that morning to wheel, and I checked the campsite for tracks, but there were none other than mine, my fiancée's, and my dog's. This animal sounded much larger than my 35-pound border collie, so I have no earthly idea why it didn't leave tracks. We've been to Uwari a few times since then, and my dog is always very suspicious of the woods at night. This was about 11 years ago, when I lived in southern Montana. We have coyotes and an occasional mountain lion sighting, but no bears. My house was just a bit outside of town, and the neighborhood made a large circle. We'd seen mountain lions on the cliffs behind our house and coyotes a couple streets further back before. It was late summer or early fall, around 2 or 3 a.m., when I decided to go for a walk, like I did often. Now there was this spot on my walk that was a large open lot that was a hill on a curved part of the road, so you couldn't see around it. On the other side of this area was a drained irrigation ditch. Now, this lot always gave me the creeps, and it wasn't just me. Everyone I talked to didn't like this area. I had just gotten to this area when the asphalt turned to gravel and my flashlight went out. I heard a truck come barreling around the corner, and the person driving slammed on the brakes right in front of me. I thought it was a little weird since I was on the side of the road, but then I realized he wasn't looking at me. I turned to look towards the irrigation ditch, and that's when I saw them. 3 large masses moved out from behind a tree. They had the ears and muzzle of a dog or wolf. Their bodies were muscular, but they were hunched over and moved in a really odd fashion. They'd extend one claw forward and then do something like a hop-drag motion for the rest of their body to catch up. They all disappeared into the ditch. I looked back at the truck, and the guy stepped on the gas, kicking up rocks behind him as he sped off. I was left in the dark for a few moments, stunned, and then my flashlight flickered back on. It would have been faster for me to go home past the empty lot and irrigation ditch, but I sprinted the other way. A house from mine had an alleyway that went back to some caves, with large lilac bushes lining the alley. As I was running by the alley, I heard rustling. I got to my house and went to fling open the sliding glass door when I heard a low growl from behind. I ran inside, shut the door, and shined the light into the bushes that the growl had come from. My light caught the reflection of eyes before it disappeared. I went back the next day. Based on the tree they'd come out from behind, they were about 4 feet tall, hunched over. Where I saw the eyes, it would have been about 7 feet. I didn't go walking at night after that.